What happens when one of Hollywood's calmest and most respected stars walks onto a talk show stage, and the conversation suddenly turns into something no one expected? The studio lights of the View glowed warm against the polished desk. The audience buzzed with anticipation, a mixture of excitement and curiosity filling the air. It was supposed to be a routine interview, another celebrity visit, another charming conversation, another round of applause. But on this particular morning, something in the atmosphere felt different. When Keanu Reeves stepped onto the stage, the crowd erupted into cheers. The applause wasn't just loud, it was heartfelt. There was something about him that audiences everywhere adored. Maybe it was his quiet humility. Maybe it was the way he carried himself with calm sincerity in a world that often thrived on chaos. Keanu gave his familiar, slightly shy smile and waved to the crowd. Thank you, he said softly, nodding to the audience. Across the table sat the panel of hosts, including Sonny Hostin, who leaned forward with an attentive expression. The hosts welcomed him warmly at first, the kind of polished friendliness daytime television had perfected. Keanu, it's so good to have you here, Sonny said with a polite smile. Keanu nodded. It's really nice to be here. Thank you for having me. The conversation began easily enough. They talked about his latest project, his decades-long career, and the incredible fan loyalty he'd built over the years. The audience laughed at a few lighthearted moments, clapped at the mention of his iconic films, and hung onto every quiet word he spoke. Keanu answered every question thoughtfully, pausing before speaking, his tone measured and sincere. It was classic Keanu. Calm, respectful, grounded. But then the conversation shifted. Sunny tilted her head slightly, her expression sharpening just a bit. The tone of her voice changed, not dramatically, but enough for attentive viewers to notice. You've been in Hollywood for a long time, she said. Long enough to see how the industry really works behind the scenes. Keanu nodded slowly. That's true. And with everything happening in the world right now, Sunny continued, her words deliberate, many celebrities are speaking out about political and social issues. The studio audience grew quieter. Sunny leaned forward. But you've always been very quiet about those things. There was a pause. Not awkward, but noticeable. Keanu folded his hands together on the table. I try to listen more than I speak, he replied calmly. A few audience members murmured approvingly. Sunny gave a small smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. But don't you think people with your platform have a responsibility to speak up? She pressed. The energy in the studio shifted again. The other hosts glanced briefly at each other. Keanu stayed perfectly composed. I think everyone has their own way of contributing, he said carefully. Sunny didn't let it go. But silence can sometimes be interpreted as indifference, she said. A few people in the audience shifted in their seats. Keanu blinked slowly. Not annoyed, not defensive, just thoughtful. I understand why some people feel that way, he said. But I try to focus on kindness and actions rather than statements. There was a small ripple of applause from the audience. Sunny raised an eyebrow. But actions without public accountability can still allow problems to continue, she replied. Now the tension was unmistakable. The room felt tighter somehow. One of the other hosts gave a nervous laugh, trying to lighten the moment. Sunny's getting serious this morning, she joked. A few audience members laughed softly. But Sunny didn't look away from Keanu. She was studying him now. And Keanu, still calm, met her gaze without hostility. I think conversations like this are important, he said quietly. Sunny nodded slowly. So, let's have one. The words landed heavier than expected. A murmur rippled through the audience. Some people leaned forward in their seats. Others glanced at each other. This was no longer the friendly morning interview everyone had expected. Sunny clasped her hands together. Let's talk about responsibility, she said. The camera zoomed slightly closer. Keanu shifted in his chair, still composed but clearly aware that the tone of the conversation had changed. What kind of responsibility? He asked. The responsibility of influence, Sunny replied. The audience was completely silent now. Sunny continued. You're admired by millions of people. Young people. Fans who look up to you. She paused. Do you think staying neutral sends a right message? Another pause. Keanu took a breath. I don't think kindness is neutral, he said. That answer triggered a quiet wave of applause. Sunny tilted her head again. But kindness doesn't always challenge injustice, she countered. The tension sharpened. The other hosts were now watching closely. Even the production crew behind the cameras seemed frozen in the moment. Keanu's calm expression didn't change, but something deeper flickered behind his eyes. Not anger, not frustration. Something more thoughtful, more personal. You're right, he said slowly. Sunny seemed surprised by the quick acknowledgement. But, Keanu continued, I also believe conversations should come from understanding, not pressure. Sunny leaned back slightly, considering that. The audience watched every movement, every pause, every word. What had started as a routine interview was slowly transforming into something else entirely. Something more intense. Sunny tapped her fingers lightly on the desk. Some people would say avoiding the conversation is a form of pressure too, she said. The words hung in the air. Keanu exhaled slowly. You might be right about that. The admission surprised the audience. But Sunny didn't smile. Instead, she leaned forward once more. And if you are aware of that, she asked carefully, why stay quiet? For the first time since the interview began, Keanu hesitated. Not long.
Just a moment.
But it was enough for the entire room to feel it. The camera captured his thoughtful expression. The audience held their breath. And somewhere in the control room, producers exchanged worried glances. Because what was unfolding on live television was no longer just an interview. It was becoming a confrontation. And no one knew exactly where it was going next. Keanu finally looked back up. His voice calm, but deeper now. Because sometimes, he said slowly, the loudest voices in the room aren't always the ones creating real change. A few people in the audience gasped softly. Sunny's expression tightened slightly. The tension had officially crossed a line. The studio lights seemed hotter, the silence heavier. And everyone watching, both in the room and at home, could feel it. Something bigger had just begun. And this quiet conversation was about to turn into a moment no one on The View would forget. The moment lingered like electricity in the air. You could feel it moving through the studio, quiet, tense, unpredictable. Timothée Chalamet sat calmly at the table, his posture relaxed but alert now, like someone who had just realized a casual conversation had turned into something far more serious. Across from him, Joy Behar watched him closely, her expression half smile, half challenge. The audience sensed it too. That strange feeling when an interview stops being scripted television and starts becoming real. Joy tapped her pen lightly against the table, the soft sound echoing faintly through the studio microphones. So, she said casually, you're part of a new generation of actors who speak very openly about social issues. Timothy nodded slowly. I think a lot of artists today feel connected to the world around them. Joy tilted her head. But sometimes it sounds less like connection and more like preaching. A few gasps rippled through the crowd. The other hosts glanced at each other. Timothy didn't immediately respond. Instead, he paused for a moment, clearly thinking about how to answer without escalating the tension that was already starting to build. I don't see it as preaching, he said finally. I see it as participating. Joy leaned forward. Participating in what? In conversations that affect people's lives. The audience murmured quietly. Joy chuckled. But you're an actor. A few scattered laughs followed. Timothy smiled politely again, but this time his eyes carried a little more focus. Yes, he said calmly, but actors are also citizens. A light wave of applause rolled through the studio. Joy raised her eyebrows. Well, that's one way to look at it. One of the other hosts tried to shift the tone. Let's talk about your new film, she said quickly, smiling. You play a very complex character, someone struggling with identity and pressure. What was that like? The tension eased slightly as Timothy began describing the emotional challenges of the role. He spoke about long nights on set, about digging into the psychology of the character, about wanting to tell stories that reflected real human experiences. The audience listened closely. For a moment, it seemed like the interview might return to safe territory. But Joy wasn't finished. She waited patiently until the conversation slowed. Then she leaned back toward the microphone again. She said thoughtfully, your character sounds like someone dealing with a lot of internal conflict. Timothy nodded. That's what drew me to the role. Joy folded her arms. And yet, when actors talk about struggles, sometimes regular people feel like you're comparing movie set problems to real-life ones. The room went quiet again. Timothy blinked. That's not my intention. But it happens, Joy replied. A few audience members shifted in their seats. The cameras zoomed slightly closer now. This was no longer just an interview. It was turning into a debate. Timothy kept his tone measured. I think storytelling helps people understand each other, he said. It's not about comparing struggles. Joy smiled faintly. Some people might disagree. The audience murmured again. Timothy took a breath. And that's okay, he said calmly. People should disagree. That answer seemed to surprise Joy for a moment. She studied him again, almost like she was reassessing her approach. Then she asked the question that made several producers glance nervously toward each other behind the cameras. Do you think actors understand everyday life? The studio became very still. Timothy's eyes flickered briefly toward the audience before returning to Joy. I try to, he said honestly. Joy leaned closer. But you grew up around the arts, right? Film sets, creative circles, not exactly the same world most people live in. There it was. The tension had officially crossed into something personal. Timothy shifted slightly in his chair. That's true, he admitted. But empathy doesn't require the same background. The audience applauded again, louder this time. Joy laughed softly. You're very good at answering questions. Timothy smiled. I've had practice. The crowd chuckled, but the tension still lingered. Joy rested her chin on her hand for a moment before speaking again. Let me ask you something honestly, she said. Do actors ever worry they're becoming out of touch? The question hung in the air. Even the audience seemed unsure how to react. Timothy looked thoughtful again. I think anyone can become out of touch, he replied slowly. Not just actors. Joy nodded. That's fair. Then she added quietly, but Hollywood has a reputation for living in a bubble. The studio reacted with scattered applause and murmurs. Timothy remained calm. Sometimes, he said, but the industry is made up of thousands of people from different backgrounds. Joy raised an eyebrow. Still, you're part of a very powerful system. Timothy leaned forward slightly now. I'm part of a storytelling industry. Joy smiled again. And storytelling can shape opinions. The audience reacted with another wave of murmurs. Timothy didn't deny it. That's true. Joy nodded slowly. So when actors speak publicly, they know millions of people are listening. Yes. And that influence carries responsibility. Timothy met her gaze directly. I agree. The audience applauded again. For a moment, the conversation felt balanced again. But Joy wasn't done testing him. You seem very thoughtful, she said. But some critics say your generation of actors can be overly sensitive. A few audience members groaned quietly. Timothy raised his eyebrows slightly. In what way? Joy shrugged. Everything becomes a big emotional discussion. The tension returned instantly. Timothy considered the comment carefully. Then he said something that made the entire studio go quiet again. I think caring about things isn't a weakness. A ripple of applause rolled through the audience. Joy smiled, but there was a flicker of surprise in her expression now. Timothy continued calmly. If people talk about emotions more openly today, that might actually be progress. The crowd clapped louder this time. Joy laughed softly. Well, now you're giving a speech. Timothy shook his head slightly. No, he said. Just sharing a perspective. The audience seemed firmly on his side now, but the tension between the two remained. Joy leaned back again, crossing her arms thoughtfully. All right, she said slowly. You've handled every question very calmly. Timothy smiled. I'm trying. Joy looked directly at him. Let's see how you handle the next one. The crowd leaned forward slightly. Even the other hosts seemed unsure where this was going. Joy paused dramatically before speaking again. Then she asked a question that made the entire studio inhale sharply. Do you think Hollywood actors sometimes take themselves too seriously? The room fell into complete silence. Timothy blinked. For the first time since the interview began, he hesitated. And that hesitation was all Joy needed to push the conversation somewhere nobody in the audience expected. Move in a conversation that had already captured the attention of everyone present. For the first time since the interview began, Timothée Chalamet didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched across the studio like a tightening wire. The audience leaned forward in their seats. Some people glanced at each other, sensing that the conversation had reached a turning point. Joy Behar watched him carefully, her expression calm but unmistakably provocative. Do you think Hollywood actors sometimes take themselves too seriously? It sounded like a simple question, but the way she asked it made it feel like a challenge. Timothy exhaled slowly, folding his hands together on the table. When he finally spoke, his voice was still calm, but there was something firmer underneath it now. I think any profession can take itself too seriously. A few audience members clapped quietly. Joy smiled, though the smile didn't fully reach her eyes. That's a diplomatic answer. Timothy tilted his head slightly. It's an honest one. The crowd murmured again. The other hosts shifted subtly in their seats, sensing that the interview had moved into unfamiliar territory. Joy leaned forward. But let's be real, she said. Actors walk red carpets, attend award shows, get paid millions, and then talk about how difficult their lives are. A ripple of reactions spread through the audience. Some laughter, some uncomfortable silence. Timothy nodded slowly. I understand why that perception exists. Joy's eyebrow lifted. So, you admit it? I admit that people see things differently, he replied. The audience applauded again. Joy tapped her pen on the table. But perception usually comes from somewhere. Timothy met her gaze again. Yes, he said calmly. And sometimes perception comes from headlines rather than reality. The audience reacted instantly, with louder applause. Joy laughed softly. Oh, you're pushing back now. Timothy smiled faintly. I'm just explaining my perspective. But the tone of the conversation had changed. What started as a promotional interview had turned into a quiet standoff. Joy leaned back again, studying him. You know what I think, she said. The audience fell silent again. I think young actors today believe their voices are just as important as people who've spent decades studying politics, economics, history. A few murmurs of agreement came from somewhere in the crowd. Timothy listened carefully. Then he answered with a calmness that seemed almost deliberate. I don't think actors replace experts. Joy tilted her head. But you still speak publicly about serious issues. Yes. And millions of fans listen. Timothy nodded. That's true. Joy leaned forward again. So, why should people take political or social advice from movie stars? The question landed like a stone in still water. Timothy paused again, but this time his hesitation wasn't uncertainty. It was restraint. I don't think anyone should blindly follow celebrities, he said. The audience seemed surprised by the answer. Joy blinked. You don't. No. Timothy continued. People should listen to many voices. Experts, journalists, teachers, and yes, artists too. A wave of applause erupted through the studio. Joy chuckled. That's very balanced. Timothy smiled slightly. I try. The crowd laughed lightly, but the tension hadn't disappeared. If anything, it was growing sharper. Joy crossed her arms. But let's talk about influence, she continued. Your fans hang on every word you say. Timothy shook his head gently. I don't expect them to. Joy smirked. Come on. You're one of the biggest stars of your generation. A few audience members cheered. Timothy shrugged modestly. That doesn't mean people should treat my opinions as facts. The audience applauded again, this time louder than before. Joy leaned closer to the table. Well, that's refreshing, she admitted. Then her tone shifted again. But you do realize something, right? Timothy looked at her. What's that? Joy spoke slowly now. When celebrities step into serious discussions, they open themselves to criticism. Timothy nodded immediately. I agree. Joy looked slightly surprised by how quickly he answered. You do? Yes, he said simply. Public conversation should include criticism. The audience applauded again. Joy laughed. You're very calm under pressure. Timothy smiled. I'm not sure it's pressure. That line made the crowd react with a mixture of laughter and applause. Joy raised both eyebrows now. Oh, really? Timothy leaned slightly forward, his voice still composed. We're just talking. But the atmosphere didn't feel casual anymore. The studio lights suddenly felt brighter. The air felt heavier. Joy tapped her fingers on the table again. You know what's interesting? She said. What? You're incredibly polite, but you're also disagreeing with almost everything I'm saying. The audience laughed. Timothy chuckled softly. That's not my goal. Joy pointed at him playfully. But it's happening. The crowd laughed again. For a moment, the tension softened. But then Joy asked something that instantly changed the energy again. Let me ask you something personal, she said. Timothy nodded cautiously. Sure. Joy's voice became more direct now. Do you think fame has changed you? The question caught him slightly off guard. He thought about it carefully. I hope not, he said. Joy tilted her head. But it must. In some ways, he admitted. The audience listened closely. Joy continued. You're surrounded by attention, wealth, success that affects people. Timothy nodded again. It can. Joy leaned closer. So, how do you stay grounded? For a moment, the tension eased as Timothy began speaking about his family, his friends, and the people who kept him connected to reality. He spoke about growing up in a creative but modest environment and how his parents always encouraged humility. The audience listened warmly. Some even applauded. But Joy wasn't finished. After he finished speaking, she paused thoughtfully. Then she said something that made the entire room freeze again. Well, humility is good. Timothy nodded politely. But sometimes, Joy continued slowly, actors talk about humility while living lives most people can't even imagine. A few audience members gasped. The cameras zoomed closer. Timothy blinked. The conversation had just crossed into its most uncomfortable territory yet. He looked directly at Joy now. Still calm. Still respectful. But there was a clear intensity in his voice when he finally responded. I've never claimed my life is harder than anyone else's. The audience burst into applause. Joy opened her mouth slightly, clearly not expecting such a direct reply. Timothy continued quietly. But I do believe stories matter, and the people who tell them should care about the world they're part of. The applause grew louder. Joy leaned back in her chair slowly. For the first time since the interview began, she seemed slightly taken aback. The audience could feel it. The balance of the conversation had shifted, and the next exchange would determine whether this interview calmed down or exploded into the kind of television moment people would talk about for years. For a brief moment, the studio felt suspended in time. The applause slowly faded, but the tension it left behind lingered in the air like a storm waiting to break. Timothy Chalamet sat calmly at the table, his hands folded again, his expression composed but focused. Across from him, Joy Behar leaned back in her chair. For the first time since the interview began, she seemed to be reconsidering her next move. The audience could feel it. This was no longer a light celebrity interview. It had turned into something far more unpredictable. Joy cleared her throat slightly and glanced toward the other hosts before returning her attention to Timothy. Well, she said with a half-smile, you certainly came prepared today. A ripple of laughter passed through the audience. Timothy smiled politely. I didn't know there was a test. More laughter. The moment eased slightly, but the underlying tension remained. Joy tapped her pen against the desk again. You've handled every question very carefully, she said. Timothy shrugged lightly. I just try to answer honestly. Joy tilted her head. But honesty can sometimes create controversy. The audience murmured again. Timothy nodded. That's true. Joy leaned forward slightly. and yet you seem comfortable stepping into serious conversations. I think conversations are healthy, Timothy replied. Joy gave a small chuckle. Yes, but not everyone agrees on what those conversations should look like. Timothy didn't immediately answer this time. Instead, he glanced briefly toward the audience, almost as if acknowledging the energy in the room. Then he spoke quietly. I think listening is just as important as speaking. The audience responded with another round of applause. Joy smiled, though her eyes still held that sharp curiosity. You know what I find fascinating? She said. What's that?
Timothy asked.
Joy leaned forward again, resting her elbows on the table. You're one of the most famous young actors in the world, yet you talk like someone who wants to avoid conflict. The audience reacted with soft laughter. Timothy smiled slightly. I don't enjoy conflict. Joy raised an eyebrow. Then you picked an interesting industry. More laughter rippled through the room. Timothy nodded. That's fair. The tension softened for a moment as the conversation drifted toward lighter topics. One of the other hosts asked about the challenges of filming overseas, and Timothy described long shooting days, unpredictable weather, and the pressure of delivering emotional performances. The audience listened attentively again. For a moment, it seemed like the dramatic edge of the conversation might finally fade. But Joy had one more thought she clearly wanted to explore. As the conversation paused, she leaned toward the microphone again. You know, she said slowly, there's something interesting about fame. Timothy looked at her. What do you mean? Joy tapped the table lightly. Fame amplifies everything. The audience grew quiet again, the good and the bad. Timothy nodded thoughtfully. That's probably true. Joy continued. When someone famous speaks, it becomes news.
Headlines.
Social media debates. Timothy agreed. That's the world we live in now. Joy looked directly at him again. And sometimes celebrities don't realize how powerful that microphone really is. The studio atmosphere tightened again. Timothy answered calmly. I think many of us are aware of that responsibility. Joy tilted her head slightly. But awareness doesn't always stop people from saying controversial things. Timothy paused. That's part of public conversation. Joy smiled faintly. And sometimes the public pushes back. The audience murmured.
Timothy nodded.
And that's their right. Joy watched him carefully again. You're very comfortable with disagreement. Timothy thought about that for a moment. I think disagreement is part of democracy. That line triggered one of the loudest rounds of applause so far. Some audience members even stood briefly before sitting back down. Joy blinked in mild surprise at the reaction. Well, she said with a laugh, you've got the crowd on your side today. Timothy smiled. I think they're just enjoying the conversation. Joy leaned back in her chair again, crossing her arms thoughtfully. You know what? She said. What? You're much tougher in interviews than people might expect. The audience laughed. Timothy raised his eyebrows. I'm not trying to be tough. Joy smirked. But you are pushing back. Timothy nodded calmly. When I disagree, yes. Joy chuckled. Well, television audiences love a good debate. The crowd clapped again. One of the other hosts jumped in quickly, sensing the growing intensity. I actually think this is refreshing, she said. We rarely get guests who engage this deeply. The audience applauded again. Timothy smiled gratefully. I appreciate that. Joy glanced at the studio clock briefly. They were approaching the end of the segment, but she clearly had one last question, and the tone of her voice changed when she asked it. All right, she said slowly. Let's end with something simple. Timothy nodded. Okay. Joy leaned closer. If a young fan watching this interview asked you one question, the studio fell silent again. What would you want them to ask? Timothy blinked, clearly surprised by the direction of the question. He thought about it carefully. The audience waited. The cameras zoomed in slightly. Finally, he answered. I'd want them to ask how to stay curious about the world. The crowd applauded warmly. Joy tilted her head. That's an interesting answer. Timothy continued. Because curiosity leads to empathy, and empathy helps people understand each other. More applause filled the studio. Joy nodded slowly. That's a very thoughtful response. Then she added something quietly that caught the entire room off guard. But curiosity can also lead to criticism. The audience murmured again. Timothy nodded calmly. And that's okay. Joy leaned back again, studying him with a thoughtful expression. Well, she said slowly, this has certainly been one of our more spirited interviews. The audience laughed. Timothy chuckled too. I didn't expect it to go this way. Joy smiled. Neither did we. The crowd applauded again. But behind the applause, something else was already beginning to happen. Backstage producers were whispering to each other. Clips of the exchange were already being marked for highlight segments. And somewhere beyond the studio walls, the internet was about to discover what had just happened. Within hours, this conversation would spread across social media, news outlets, and entertainment channels everywhere. And the reactions would be far more explosive than anyone in the studio could have imagined. For a few seconds, nobody moved. The lights were still blazing overhead, the audience still seated, the host still at the table. But the atmosphere had shifted from tension to something quieter, almost reflective. Across the table, Sunny Hostin rested her hands on the desk, glancing toward Henry Cavill. The conversation they had just finished wasn't a typical celebrity segment. It hadn't been promotional. It hadn't been playful. It had been real. And everyone in that room knew it. Some audience members began clapping again, this time not as part of the show, but as a spontaneous reaction. The applause grew stronger, echoing across the studio. Henry stood up first, offering a polite nod to the crowd. Thank you, he said warmly. Sunny rose as well, giving him a respectful smile. Thank you for being open to the discussion, she said. Henry shook her hand. Thank you for having the conversation. The exchange was calm, even cordial. But outside the studio walls, the story had already taken on a life of its own. Because during the live broadcast, clips from the debate had started appearing online. Within minutes, social media platforms were flooding with reactions. Short videos showing the moment Sunny said the word privilege. Clips of Henry responding calmly about humility. Segments where the audience erupted in applause. Every angle of the conversation was being dissected. On one side, some viewers praised Sunny for asking difficult questions. She held him accountable, one commenter wrote. On the other side, many praised Henry for his composure. He stayed calm and respectful the entire time. Another post read. Soon, the debate wasn't just about the interview anymore. It had become part of a much larger cultural conversation. Entertainment websites began posting headlines about the exchange between Henry Cavill and Sunny Hostin on The View. Commentators on television discussed the moment. Podcasters analyzed every line. Within hours, the phrase Cavill versus Hostin was trending across multiple platforms. Back inside the studio, however, the energy had softened. Some audience members approached the stage as the crew prepared for the next segment. A few people thanked the hosts for the discussion. Others complimented Henry on how he handled the questions. One woman in the front row said quietly, "That was one of the most interesting interviews I've ever seen here." Henry smiled politely. "Thank you," he said. Nearby, Sunny was speaking with one of the producers. "People are going to talk about that," the producer whispered. Sunny glanced briefly toward Henry before nodding. "I hope they do," she replied. "That's the point of conversations like this." Meanwhile, Henry gathered his jacket from the back of his chair. One of the other hosts walked over to him. "You handled that well," she said with a grin. Henry chuckled softly. "I think everyone handled it well," he replied. But as he walked backstage, he could already hear staff members discussing their phones. "Look at this," one assistant said. Another responded, "It's everywhere." Henry glanced at one of the screens. Clips from the interview were already circulating with thousands, then hundreds of thousands of views. Comment sections were filling rapidly. Some people debated the meaning of privilege. Others argued about celebrity influence. And many simply praised the fact that the conversation had remained respectful despite its intensity. Later that evening, entertainment journalists began publishing full breakdowns of the moment. Some called it a rare, unscripted clash. Others described it as a surprisingly thoughtful debate. One article described it as a reminder that real dialogue is still possible on live television. Sunny, meanwhile, addressed the moment during a brief follow-up discussion later in the show. "These are the conversations people are having at home," she told viewers. "And our job is to bring those conversations into the open." Across town, Henry was preparing to leave the studio. A reporter caught him near the exit. "Henry," the reporter asked quickly, "any thoughts about the interview today?" Henry paused. He smiled politely. "I appreciate thoughtful discussions," he said simply. Then he stepped into his car. But the story didn't stop there. Over the next several days, the interview continued to spread online. Clips reached millions of views. Reaction videos appeared across YouTube. Some viewers supported Sonny's challenging questions. Others admired Henry's calm responses. And many people said something even more interesting. They said the moment showed what debate should look like: two people disagreeing without hostility. In a media environment often dominated by shouting matches and viral outrage, that alone made the conversation stand out. Weeks later, some fans still talked about it. Not because it was explosive, but because it was unexpected. Two public figures from very different worlds sitting across from each other, asking difficult questions and answering them honestly. And maybe that's why the moment resonated so widely. Because it reminded people that conversations, even uncomfortable ones, can still be respectful. Now we want to hear from you. What did you think about this intense moment between Henry Cavill and Sunny Hostin on The View? Was Sunny right to push the conversation further? Or did Henry handle the situation in the best possible way? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy dramatic, cinematic stories about unforgettable moments like this, make sure you subscribe to Live Narratives, like this video, and share it with your friends. Because the next story we uncover might be even more shocking than this one.